Hi, my name is Jessie February, and I am a member of the Port Elizabeth Chess Club, otherwise known as PECC, and I'm happy to present to you my first ever video series on the endgame. In the first video, we will be focusing on some pawn endgames and concepts to help get you started. Contrary to what you might believe, the endgame is in fact the most important part of a chess game. And even more so, the pawn ending is the most fundamental. And that's where we will begin. So the reason I say it's the most important type of endgame is that most endgames have the potential of reducing to this kind of endgame after the exchanging of pieces. It's really important to be able to tell whether a given endgame is a win or a draw, or in fact a loss. So let us begin. Over here, you could even set this up on your own chessboard and give it a try, because trial and error will help you perfect an endgame such as this. Alright, so let's take a look at the king and pawn ending in front of us. And over here we have the white king on e1, the white pawn on e2, and the black king on e8. And the aim of the game, of course, is to promote the pawn. And usually I try to keep things really simple and provide at least 3 things you need to remember. Just like in the opening, there are 3 things to remember: control the center, develop your pieces, and get your king safe. In the endgame, I prefer to work in 3s as well. So the first thing you need to know about an endgame like this is that the king belongs in front of the pawn. And this is exactly what you're going to try and do. And the reason we try to get the king in front of the pawn is so that it can shoulder black's king once it tries to approach and attack the pawn. Usually you find positions where, for instance, the pawn moves forward and so does the king. You end up with a very drawish type of position. And I will just quickly show you. And here we have reached a complete draw, stalemate. So let's go back to the beginning where our king was on e1, our pawn was on e2, and the black king was on e8. And like I said, you want to try and get the king in front of the pawn first so that it can start guiding your pawn forward. So let's take a look. King d2 or king f2 seems to be very logical. King e7, the black king is going to try and make it very difficult, try and stay on the same file as the pawn to stop it from advancing all the way to the end. King e3, king e6, and now we have completed the first step, getting the king in front of the pawn. The second thing you need to remember is something called, since 2 kings cannot stand directly next to each other, the closest they can get to one another is 1 square apart. And this square, either being along a file, or if the king was over here, along the rank, and it can occur on either side. This is called opposition, when a king is only 1 square away from the enemy king, and this is as close as they can get to one another. This king cannot go to any of these 3 squares, being d5, e5, and f5. Reason being, it would be illegal. It would be an illegal move. So in this case, the king can only go to d6, f6, d7, e7, or f7. And that's exactly what we're trying to achieve here. It's to push the black king back and eventually advance our own pawn. So right here, the best move would be to move to the side, d6 or f6. And here, black could possibly go to d6. And this is number 3, trying to gain control of the key squares. I personally prefer to use the term building a bridge, although many of you know that to be a rook ending kind of concept. So I'm going to call it taking control of the key squares. And over here, the king will advance just diagonally 1 square, taking control of e6, e5, and e4, allowing the pawn to be escorted along these 3 squares. Over here, black could be waiting on the other side of these key squares to stop the pawn. And the best move here is to go ahead with number 2, rule number 2 again, and that is opposition. King to e5. Once you have achieved opposition, black once again has the decision of either moving to the side or back. And let's say they move to the side again, this time on f7. Can you find the key square for the king to move to? You can even pause the video after I ask these questions just to try and see if you know where the king needs to go. King goes to d6. Yes. And now it is covering e7, e6, and e5. The black king could, in fact, try to go after the pawn on e2, but here it is a little too slow since the move is, yes, e4. And with the move e4, the king can no longer go to f5 trying to attack the pawn, since the pawn is covering that square, and it cannot go to any of the key squares because of the king. The pawn can easily now go to e5, e6, and e7. So here the king goes to f7. You may think that opposition is the answer here. However, the pawn will be undefended and the king will go to f6. So let's take a look. If we go to d7, king f6, threatening this, and now we have to actually go back and it becomes a waste of a move. So the best move here after king f7 is to push the pawn, e5. The king goes to e8, and what is the move? We go to rule number 2, and the move is king e6. Now after king d8, white moves, creating the 3 key squares for the pawn on f7, being e6, e7, and e8. Now the pawn can safely be guided to promotion, and that's exactly where it wants to be. So no matter where black moves, it is pretty much over. Becomes a queen, we can put a queen over there, and easily winning the game. So just to recap on the king and pawn ending, there are 3 things that you need to remember. Number 1, get the king in front of the pawn. Number 2, opposition. Opposition, opposition, opposition. I cannot say this enough. Opposition is a general concept that will be used in the majority of the king and pawn endings that we will do, as well as just about all endgames. The king becomes a very active piece in the endgame, and you will see that much later on as well. And number 3, taking control of the key squares. Always trying to move forward, guiding the pawn, and creating those key squares for the pawn. Even though black here could make it very difficult for white to promote the pawn, it is indeed possible. So just practice, trial and error, and you will perfect it. So the next endgame we're going to take a look at is if the pawn is on the flank, being on the A file or the H file. If the enemy king is on A8 and there is just one pawn and one king, being a side pawn, a pawn on the side of the board, it is a draw. And let's take a look at why. We're going to try and follow all the rules of an endgame like this, keeping the king in front of the pawn. The king can simply just move up and down. So no matter where white plays, this king will try and stay on a7 or b8 to just avoid the queening square being kind of controlled by the white king. So now it's white to move. White plays king a6, black plays king b8, and white plays a4. King a8, a5, king b8, king b6, opposition, king a8, a6, king b8, a7, and king a8. And there's no way to control the key square b7. b7 is a very important key square. Usually there are key squares on both sides of the pawn, but this time there is only one key square, being b7. And as long as the black king is controlling this key square from, of course, the corner, it is a draw, unfortunately. So now we know the side pawn is a draw. Have you ever heard of rule of the square? Have you ever heard of rule of the square? If not, here is your chance to learn all about it. So usually you're sitting in an endgame, and by the time you've reached the endgame, you are in serious time trouble. And this is not something you want, because surely there's not enough time to calculate the perfect move to play. And this is a quick method of being able to know whether your pawn is going to promote or not, and really quickly too. There's the black king on b5, the white king on a2, and the white pawn on f5. That is not supposed to be legal. So the king obviously cannot save the pawn directly. The black king will be able to catch up with the pawn if white decides to move the king in. So if it is white to move, we ask ourselves, can our pawn reach the end square in time, f8, before the king gets to us? And there is an easy way to know this. So if you take a look at the pawn and you draw a line, an imaginary line, all the way diagonally, you reach c8. And with c8, you're actually forming a box, believe it or not. And the box runs from c8, being a corner, to c5, to f5, to f8, and back to c8. And this box will help you realize whether you can promote the pawn or not. If the black king is inside of this box and it's white to move, you will not be able to promote. So if it's black to move, black plays here, white moves the pawn, moving forward, f7, e7, and even trying to queen, the king will just capture. But if it is white to move, where's the box? c8, c5, f5, and f8. Pawn moves forward. Where's the box? d8, d6, f6, and f8. The king tries to move forward to c6. Is it inside the box? No. Pawn moves forward. King tries to go to d7, catching up with the pawn. Will it be able to catch up? No, because the box is now on these four squares. And the pawn will safely promote. And this is a very nice way to figure that out. So let's take a look at this position. Where's the box? We go diagonally. We reach a8, a4, e4, and e8. Is the king inside of the box? Yes. So whether it be white to move or black to move, black will be able to catch up with the pawn. So we go e5, king b6, e6, king c6, e7, king d7, catching up with the pawn. So when you are in time trouble, it'll be very easy to figure out whether your pawn will be able to promote or not. You simply draw the box in your mind and you'll be able to know quite easily. So now we're going to shake things up a little bit with an endgame tactical puzzle. And I'm a huge lover of tactics, so I really hope that you will enjoy this as much as I do. In this position, it is white to move. As you can see, the king is a little bit further away from the white pawns than the black king is. And if you were to try and move the king in, black will simply just follow and eventually capture the pawns. We don't want that. So like I said, in a tactical position, you will want to find a tactical resource. And I can help you out with that with another 3 basic principles of tactics, even in an endgame. In any tactic, there are 3 things to look out for in the form of forceful moves. Number 1 being check. Number 2, a capture. And number 3, an attacking move. And over here, two of those are not really possible. So there's one you could be zooming in on. So try to pause the video, take some time in this position, and try to solve it before moving on to the solution. Alright, if you are ready to see the solution, let's go. The move is, in fact, g6. Yes. And what happens if they take? It's easy to think that if they capture, you would just capture back. However, this would lead to either a drawish or losing position, depending on how black plays this, of course. Black is the only one who could indeed win this position if he really tried and if maybe white makes a mistake here as well. So let's go back. So the move is g6. Depends, or it doesn't really matter which black pawn takes here. Maybe he takes with the f pawn. And now the move you needed to spot is h6, forcing black to capture with the g7 pawn. And now the winning move is f6, guiding this pawn home. Alternatively, you could have g6 capturing with the h7 pawn. And now the move is f6, capturing back and h6, guiding the pawn. What's really nice about this position is that white's pawns are very far advanced, which definitely stands out because white has a larger chance of queening first. The king is a very important part of the endgame, but the king isn't always needed for tactics such as this one. Next up, we have this glorious position. I want you to pack it out on your own chessboard and try to solve it with me. So pause the video and take a look. It is white to move, and it's actually winning for white. And it's not what you may think. It's not so easy, so take your time. Alright, so let's take a look at the solution. The move is king f2. And what happens if black plays h4 in this position? Some people will think that king f3 is the solution, and simply if they play h3, you capture it and try to queen. However, the black king makes it to the queening square in time, and we've already established the flank pawn is not able to promote safely. So let's go back. So the move is king f2, h4, and let's see if you found this move. King g1. Right, and the reason is after h3, we're not too hasty, we just simply played g3. And now the king could try and stop the pawn. We go king h2, king e6, king takes, king f5, and the white king takes control of the key squares, being g3, g4, and g5. And after king g6, what do? Opposition. King g4, opposition, king h6, and king f5, taking control of the next three key squares. So what is a passed pawn? A passed pawn is a pawn that is not contested by any other pawns in its way, being adjacent or on the same file of that pawn. And here we see a passed pawn on h5. And why do we call it a passed pawn? Because there are no black pawns in front of it to stop it from queening. The only thing that can stop a passed pawn are either pieces such as knights, bishops, rooks, queens, or a king. So over here we have something called an outside passed pawn. And why do we call it an outside passed pawn? Outside passed pawns are found on the flank and usually help us win the game. If we take a look at the material here, both white and black have 3 pawns each. The only difference here is that white has a passed pawn that is on the outskirts of the position. So even if the king was sitting on d5 here and it was black to move, we would find that black would have to go after this passed pawn. And after the king is distracted, white simply tries to invade black's camp and capture all the pawns he has left, while the outside passed pawn acts as a very good distraction for the black king, which was previously protecting its own pawns. So let's take a look. King d4, king g6, king c5, king takes h6, and the pawns seem to be going nowhere slowly. Simply capture, capture, king b5, king b6, king g6, king takes b4, and this pawn will indeed queen. And that is the power of an outside passed pawn. So now I will be presenting to you a couple tactical positions to end off the video. I will both give you time to pause the video and offer the solution after every tactic, so we can do it together. Let's go. Alrighty, so this is the first position I'm presenting you with, and it is white to move. How do you suppose white should win this one? So try to take your time and solve it. Okay, so the solution is to sacrifice the pawn, and you'll be promoting to queen, of course. The king will capture the queen. What happens next? The king goes to f6, king g8, g7, king h7, king f7, king h6, and promoting again to a queen. And it's easy game from there. You could simply play this, king back, and checkmate. And that is the end of the game. The next position we have here is a nice little concept called triangulation, learning about all the shapes. First we did rule of the square, and now we're doing triangulation. And triangulation is basically a concept of weighting. So triangulation is a tactic used in chess to put your opponent in Zugzwang, which is a German word basically meaning a position when it is a disadvantage to the person who will move. So triangulation forces a loss of tempo, a loss of a move. So let's take a look at this position. You can take your time, it's white to move, and see if you could use this concept to your advantage. Alright, so let's take a look at how triangulation works. Here the move is king d4, black plays king c6, white plays king c4, king d7, and here white simply goes king d5 again, completing the triangle. See, the triangle existed between d4, c4, and d5. So now it's black to move. Black has to go to e7 or any other square, and white can simply now push the pawn, and after exchanging, king takes, and it is completely winning. There's no way to stop the promotion of the pawn, and that is triangulation. So we have to mention briefly what we discussed about the opening, controlling the center, and get the king safe. Then we moved on to the king versus king and pawn ending. The tips you need to remember in this ending are: keep the king in front of the pawn, opposition, and controlling the key squares. Don't forget to practice this one over and over. Next, we took a look at tactical principles, being forceful moves. Number 1, checks. Number 2, captures. And number 3, attacking moves. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for the next one. Bye.